Hello, I'm Benjamin Miss, and in this series we are discussing well-known or influential research papers in the field of psychology. This one is commonly known as the Stanford Prison Experiment, also as the Zimbardo Experiment, the Stanford Prison Study, and this was published by Haney, Banks, and Zimbardo in 1973. Wildly influential. If you've taken an intro psych class, you've probably read about this. They discuss this in other fields as well. They made a movie about it in 2015. TV shows have spoofed it. Um, Zimbardo's become famous outside of psychology, writing many books, filming a lot of videos. You may have seen in an intro psych or class where he was in a video demonstrating some concept in psychology. And so this study has gone, has been very widely influential and yet has been controversial and has been kind of, there's been critiques of it. And so the important thing to do is to look at the actual study itself and the research that was done. Zimbardo himself is an extremely kind and open individual who has done quite a bit for promoting psychology. Whether or not the controversies around the paper are valid, it's just an interesting area to consider. So, looking at the original research, right, I found two research papers, both from 1973. They're very similar. And I guess back then it was okay to copy yourself. Same authors, same study. One was published in the Navy Research Reviews, probably as a requirement of government funding. They wanted to look at imprisonment in kind of the Navy prisons. The other one was in the International Journal of Criminology and Penology, and that is much more in depth, contains the same information basically as a Navy report, but with more. However, it's really useful to start with Zimbardo's talk to Congress about prison reform in 1971. So shortly after the study, he made a report to Congress describing part of the experiment. And what was particularly special about that talk was he advocated really hard for prison reform, like based on his observation. And he'd also had prison consultants involved in this. People who'd spent time in prison, solitary confinement, a priest who had experience in working with prisoners. And he was, clearly affected by this experience. So he shared quotes from prisoners on abuse and lack of rehabilitation. And when after the guards and the prison establishment had spoken, where they pretty much advocated for the status quo, he outlined the study and talked about the volunteers to become guards or prisoners and the mock prison, and he talked about just some really simple kind of like stuff. So first of all, he mentioned that he had the prisoners picked up by the police, the students, right? And the experiment closed down after 6 days. You've probably heard that. It was supposed to run 2 weeks. And after 6 days, he quotes, "It was no longer apparent to us or most of our subjects where they ended and their roles began." And roles is the key here, because the biggest focus on this was the influence of the roles and the structures. He notes that a third of guards became tyrannical, and this is interesting. It really was the good guards who perpetuated the prison because actually they needed the bad guys to make themselves the good guys. And this is an incredible critique about, kind of like the good ones, the good people who are like, oh, this is wrong. Look how good I am saying this is wrong and trying to support you without actually doing anything to affect that change, right? Just to be the good guy. So Zimbardo had a really interesting understanding and was quite prescient in his views of things. He quotes this in terms of what he learned from this. Individual behavior is largely under control of social forces and environmental contingencies rather than personality traits, character, willpower. What this tells us, what he's saying is related to another very famous social psychology concept called the fundamental attribution error, where we tend to attribute in others personality, dispositional characteristics as the reasons for their behaviors, while it's very clearly environmental behaviors. And there's actually a reverse of that where we excuse our own behavior by saying, oh, it was environmental influence. Well, saying the opposite for other people, where it's like, oh, it's per personality. They did something bad because they're bad. We do something bad because it was the environment that made us do it. He says, we create an illusion of freedom by attributing more internal control to ourselves, to the individual, than actually exists. So Zimbardo is saying that these structures that we create have a big influence on our behavior. And finally, and this is really quite interesting because he says this, at a time when he notes that people were saying that, outside influences like communists and fascists are fomenting unrest. He says social anarchy is obviously building in this country without any outside agitation. As soon as a person comes to the realization that he is being imprisoned by his society, he demands liberty and rebels, accepting death as an alternate. Well, let's get into the paper itself, right? And this is the main paper on the study, where they talk about the main hypothesis for why people behave being this dispositional hypothesis, which suggests that, people become guards because they have this mentality, or, for any kind of role, police, you would say the same thing, or they have this kind of like police way of thinking, right? But he's talking about the influence of the social and prison structure causing the problems, actually creating the behaviors in these people. He hypothesized that assignment to prisoner or guard would lead to different outcomes on behavioral measures. That's fine, that's not surprising. And they talked about the design, of course, right? Male subjects, assessed for mental stability, 21 participants, some of them prisoners, some were guards. The guards did their, 8-hour shifts. The prisoners were there the entire time. Cells were small, 6x9 with a cot. The cot took up at least a third of the room. Solitary confinement closet was across the hall. So this was not like a particularly pleasant situation to be in, especially for the prisoners. And they talk more about kind of like how this was set up, right? So before it began, they all completed personality tests, and the researchers claim that they chose people who would, be stable. And they did tests of Machiavellianism, which is kind of like how manipulative you are to get your way. Authoritarianism, which is how you would, deal with authority. Do you like powerful authority that basically is demanding and tells people what to do? Do you like that, being a part of that? And all these other things. And the point here was that the future prisoners and future guards scored similarly. So in these kind of personality measures, they were similar. The prisoners were arrested unexpectedly. Okay, so they weren't told this was going to happen. The Palo Alto police showed up at their homes, brought them out to the street, handcuffed them, placed them in the car, charged them with armed robbery, brought them to the station, and fingerprinted them, placed them in a detention cell. And then the experimenters showed up, blindfolded them, and drove them to the mock prison. The experimenters, stripped, sprayed, and made them stand naked in the cell yard. They were given information, had their mugshots taken. They were put in a cell in order to remain silent. Once they were all there, they were given the rules and referred to only by their number. It's a very dehumanizing process. Now, one of the major criticisms of the Stanford prison study is that it was a demonstration, not an experiment. Well, that's fair. However, they never said it wasn't, right? They described this as an exploratory study in the research design itself, right? So right away they're saying, this is preliminary. And again, the problem with the demonstration is showing that this is possible, but in order to make sure that it's, a good study, like you can do a demonstration to show something's possible as good science, but you have to have very careful controls and be able to show that there's no other possible explanations for those things. And so a big, carefully controlled study would be useful. In a lot of ways, interviewing prisoners and testing prisoners and guards in real world situations, watching influences on personality and things, and comparing it to, similar individuals who don't end up in these roles would also be quite useful. Okay, so I think the special thing here is, hey, we took a bunch of college students who hadn't really committed any crimes and we turned them into prisoners and guards, and oh, wow, this went badly, right? So the experiment didn't allow violence, physical violence, but aggressive behavior such as verbal attacks was allowed. 5 prisoners had to be released early. And again, this only lasted 6 days, and they had to still be released early due to depression, crying, rage, and anxiety. The test scores did not help predict how prisoners and guards would react. And I think what they were looking for was, to compare this to prisoner of war type situations where they couldn't predict who would break and who would not. And it's really difficult to predict that. The prisoners and guards were given mood adjective checklists throughout the study. The experience, they reported at the end negative emotional impact, both the prisoners and the guards. And the study showed a strong support for the situational over dispositional variables, right? The personality changes were very clearly, influenced by the role, not the personality. Their final observations, were interesting. Greater abuse by guards when off camera. And the guards reported they were just playing the role. They were doing what they thought the experimenters wanted. Even the most brutal guards said, well, I thought this was what you wanted for this experiment. And the researchers discussed pathological prisoner syndrome and the loss of personal identity, like what happens to the personality and identity of people with long-term imprisonment. Well, we also saw, some interesting lessons here, right, about roles, social influence, and prison abuse. So they did pretty much what they wanted to, which was to demonstrate that they could very clearly get people to behave in this way with very little influence. And again, this echoes Milgram, who, was really quite derided at the time, but has shown to be probably a much more ethical study where you could do it again. The Stanford prison study, there's just no way. Like, you could not repeat this. The effects on the students themselves was too great, in order for this to be a valid, replication. They did have some clear design issues. I mentioned this is a demonstration, not an experiment, but you could argue that the independent variable was role, prisoner, or guard, right? And the dependent variable was behaviors, attitudes, and the effects on people. So remember, with an independent variable, the IV, you have to have some kind of condition, something to compare. And the dependent variable is some kind of outcome measure. Were these great? No, but they were there. So all in all, an interesting study, something that brings a lot, perhaps, in our understanding of some of our wartime prisons and abuse that we see happening. We ask ourselves, how much of this is on the guards and how much of this is on the commanders and the structure? And I think it's very clear that the structures and the commanders themselves are really responsible for what is happening, because the environment does have this effect. Now, whether our society has clearly not taken this as a lesson, right? So interesting study, interesting implications. And this concludes our discussion. I hope you've enjoyed this analysis of the original research on the Stanford prison study, and I look forward to going over other famous research studies with you.